All right, welcome everybody to Global Affairs Unfiltered this morning. You're listening to the Jack Stockwell Radio Talk Show program, simulcasting at K Talk as well as on the stream. And where in the world do you start? Just since Tuesday of last week, where in the world, in fact, do you start? And I titled this thing, is Trump insane? What is he really doing, especially after these comments, after the UN General Assembly meeting and the comments of Trump regarding the Ukraine and leaving it to themselves and Russia being a paper tiger, and that Ukraine is completely self-sufficient in their ability to take back all of the territories that have been taken from them by Russia, which of course you know is an absolute insanity. That is never, ever, ever, in all the possibilities of time unfolding, could anything like that ever possibly happen. So what's he really up to? What's he really doing? As the Russians have said, the only way that this battle can be solved now is on the battlefield. They don't trust a word that comes out of the east, out of the west. Comments that have been made by Peskov, Zakharova, indicate clearly that they think that Trump is speaking out of the corner of his mouth, that he's being a little bit hypocritical, but at the same time giving a signal to Putin to go forward, to go ahead and do what he needs to do. Go ahead and clean up. Now, if you listen to Dr. Gilbert Doctorow, he was talking about how the Russians could end the war themselves this week by sending a dozen Oreshniks to Kyiv and just get it over with. We don't know how many Oreshnik missiles they have, but we know the West does not have its equal, except in the sense of nuclear weapons. The Oreshnik is not nuclear, although it leaves damage similar to a nuclear explosion. And then on top of all of that, while I don't believe that Putin is Trump's handler, Netanyahu certainly is. And Netanyahu will be meeting with President Trump today to work out the final logistics of what's necessary for the next attack on Iran. Hopefully the last attack on Iran that will completely decimate Iran, so that Israel can continue with its program of taking over the entire Middle East. If they can get rid of Iran, there's nothing left to stop them, because the Arab nations aren't going to do it. If the Arab nations aren't going to do anything to stop genocide, they're not going to stop Israel. And they want Israel to buy their oil anyway, even though a large majority of the oil in Israel consumes comes from Turkey. And Turkey, of course, is part of the Arab nations. No, they're not really. They don't consider themselves that, but geographically, you might say that. But I'm talking more of the Arabian Peninsula and as far over as Pakistan. So this is going to be an incredibly interesting week. The big meeting tomorrow with all of the three-star generals and admirals north of the third star, meeting in Quantico with Secretary of Defense. I just can't say Secretary of War. I just can't do that. I've tried several times. I can't get it out of my mouth. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth. I've got a little bit on that before the program's over as to ethos. They're going to be talking about ethos. And again, remember, what they release to the press is usually something very, very different than what is said behind closed doors. Now, if that's really all he's going to do is to talk about ethos and purpose, and are we all on the same page? Are we all thinking the same way? Do we understand what the president wants? Do you understand what he wants as his representative through me, the Secretary of Defense? Let's raise your right hand if you, okay, now you can go home. Apparently it's only about 45 minutes long. Two or three people I've talked to about that since it was announced said, what are they putting that much military leadership together for in one place? I mean, we know there's missiles in this country that aren't ours, waiting for a target to launch. Yeah, I don't think so. I think it may well be that. All right. Do not know if you are live on K Talk, but there is another show playing at the same time. Yeah, I know it's Alex Jones. I probably ought to just cut it off. I was trying to compete, but I don't think I can. So I'm not going to worry about it. I'll just talk to the streamers this morning. But if you at K Talk can hear me, my new Dr. JackStockwell.com website is up. I'd like you to take a look at it. Tell me what you think. All right, I'm going to end my presence at K Talk because I can't compete with a broadcast that's already going on. So that's it. I'll stop that. And I will stop this and get back to what I was talking about as far as the stream is concerned. That's supposed to be programmed open. That morning is supposed to be open. Anyway, I want to get back to what I was talking about. All the currents that are going on right now, and then of course the big laughable thing of this last week was Netanyahu's speech at the General Assembly, and the delay for his speech that occurred while the vast majority of those in attendance got up and walked out. That must have been fun. Those who got up and walked out, they talked about this ahead of time, and should we do this? No, it's about the only tool that we have left to fight against the genocide that's going on, because the United States is supporting it. And as long as the United States supports the starvation and the famine against these Palestinian children and defenseless people, there's nothing we can do about it except massive protests. And the best thing we can do is get up and walk out before this murdering ass speaks. And I don't know if you listened to his speech. I did. I listened to a lot of it because I wanted to be able to talk about it. But my goodness, it just almost every other pause was followed by another set of lies. And the only people cheering him was the Israeli delegation and the American delegation, because almost nobody else was there. Oh, it's just, I don't want to appear confused. I try to stay above the confusion, but this is just unbelievable. And as I'm sure you find it confusing to some degree as well. And every other thing coming out of President Trump's, I mean, there's just constant flip-flopping. Well, I think going back a month when he met with Putin in Alaska, I think Putin pretty well spelled out to him what's going to happen. And of course, as they come out and afterwards talk to the press, and yeah, we talked about, the possibility of a tunnel underneath the Bering Sea, and we talked about business deals and how we both can be economically benefited by the other, and advancing world trade. Probably talked a little bit about BRICS. And then I think there was a moment when Putin turned to the group that was present in the room with he and President Trump and said, "Give us a minute." This is just my imagination, of course. I have no way of proving this. That they all got up and walked out, except for Putin and Trump. Trump's bodyguards didn't want to go, but Trump told them to go. And Putin said, "All right, this is what's going to happen. We don't for one thing, Mr. Trump, believe." What's up? All right, I got to excuse me. You got to excuse me for a second. I need to answer Paul here. just just let him know. Listen, the way we're going to finish this war, and because Putin himself is having trouble at home, there are those who are pushing him to hurry up and get this over with. Because remember, Putin is kind of two different people. Well, now they're telling me that Alex Jones got turned off. All right. Let me see if I can get over there. I'm very embarrassed by this. Excuse me. I really am sorry. It's just endlessly frustrating. All right, I think we'll be in business here now. So that you can see, it's just like your hands are tied. And it's just increasingly difficult situation to deal with. But like I was saying about Putin telling Trump, remember, Putin's a lawyer. So half of him is a lawyer. The other half of him is in charge of the largest nuclear arsenal on the planet. And as a result, I guess he's trying to ride two horses. And he's getting pressure at home to end this thing from part of the population. Another part of the Russian population is pushing for him to go further and to march right into Kyiv and hang the Nazis and secure an even greater portion, probably the entire eastern portion of the Ukraine up to the Dnieper River and include Odessa and maybe beyond. So I think when he was meeting with Trump a month ago in Alaska, he was just spelling out to Trump, this is what's going to happen. And there's more and more fake news coming in all the time about how Russia's sending drones into these bordering countries, how Russia is they're flying over territory, the NATO territory, which they have to. They haven't got any choice. Ever since Sweden became a part of NATO, and you see Sweden's expanded territorial waters out into the Baltic Sea, there's no way a Russian airplane can fly up the Baltic Sea without touching one of these nations' air control areas. So there's just more and more constant war talk, more and more push for war. And the one thing that's going, I mean, how much, as I read through the international news, trying to figure out how the rest of the world is viewing Trump after his speech at the United Nations. And when he talks about all the wars he's ended, as he did there in his speech, you kind of wonder how useful the United Nations is at all. That the Europeans, if they're serious about fighting Russia, why don't they just stop importing gas from Russia? The notion that somehow or another Trump has brought peace and happiness and goodwill everywhere since he came into office, and that Israel is the victim of everybody in the neighborhood, especially Iran, and all these kinds of things that I've just been talking about, is dismissed out of hand by most of the populations of the earth. And one of the way the United States views these kinds of things, and the way that the rest of the world views these kinds of things is two totally different viewpoints. But one of the things that's really interesting is this, there's two major dynamics. Number one, the impending collapse of the Western financial system and the control of oil and gas prices. And energy, obviously, is at the core of international trade and commerce. I mean, it's the lifeblood of this planet. And no nation, according to President Washington, when he was in office, can be expected to move beyond the limits of its own interests. And all of these countries of the world have an interest in purchasing energy, preferably cheap energy, which Europe used to do before the Nord Stream, we blew up the Nord Stream pipeline, provoking Russia. And what's happened to German manufacturing and productivity, as well as some of the other countries, when they started having to buy gas from the Norwegians and the United States at 4 times the price they were buying gas from the Russians, that has led to this terrible deindustrialization. And being left to do what the Germans have done, which is essentially deindustrialize their nation, plunge their population into increasing poverty and despair, which usually precedes war talk, which is the war talk coming out of Germany. And I think that's the problem with most about what Trump is saying about Europeans in general. And then, of course, the comments on the comments that he made on the United States are absolutely ridiculous. So the United Nations does not dispose over armed forces. The United Nations can only do, frankly speaking, what the big powers are willing to support. And we're not only in arrears in terms of our payments to the United Nations, which we, at the behest of the Israelis and their lobby, have dismissed out of hand as a useless body, but we also don't supply the forces and the money that would be necessary for anything to be established in favor of the United Nations and the rest of the world. So it's just a silly comment that he made. But I think the hardest one of all to accept is really the oil and gas comments, the notion that everybody's going to stop doing business with Russia because we threaten them. If we're going to sanction the hell out of you if you do business with Russia or buy Russian gas. It's just silly nonsense. And this goes back to the core problem that we have with President Trump. And like others, especially on the Judge Napolitano podcast series and some other people outside of that, are no longer calling Trump President Trump. He's now being addressed as Biden Part 2, because his policies, his approach now are largely indistinguishable from Biden. And only one can argue, I mean, they're even more destructive, and that's tragic because our dollar is plunging. Global demand for our dollar is dying. Nobody wants it. I mean, it's going to be a very, very hard thing for us to avoid an extremely hard landing when we finally default. And default is coming. And look what's happening to gold and silver. Gold was almost $4,000 last week. And we're on the road to default. It's quite clear. But I guess the plan, it seems, I don't believe this is accidental. It seems to me the plan is to debase our currency before we finally get to the very end. So in total, I think President Trump's remarks at the UN were totally irrelevant. You know, everybody shrugs their shoulders, gets up, walks out because nothing's changed. Everything's just as it was. And anything that he says is, frankly, it's disbelieved by the leaders of all these nations who were present. I mean, there are many people trying to get the United Nations to invoke this uniting for peace thing. You know, some resolution to do something to stop this horrific onslaught against the Palestinian people by Israel, especially with what's happening now. And I think they've shut down the internet altogether in Gaza City. I saw that the other day. There is no internet. So now we can't even see the horrors upon horrors that are taking place. You know, the cell phones can't upload anything anymore. And it's very hard to do that. I mean, especially if think about this. Is the United States on the wrong side here? Thinking of Eisenhower in 56 with the Suez, you have an American president who was acting, and doing what he could do to stop what was happening, and it stopped. I think many of us have come to terms with reality that there is this new parallel universe that's unfolding on this planet. And the problem we have with our economy, this outrageous national sovereign debt that we cannot possibly maintain because we refuse to cut spending. We refuse to take the measures that are necessary to put us on any sort of a healthy plan to the future. And it means the rest of the world has said, I mean, just look at the example of Russia. First of all, most of the world does not agree with President Trump's version of the Russia-Ukrainian war. They understand that Russia was acting defensively against a force and a regime that we have done everything in our power to build up with the sole purpose of harming Russia. And in addition to not just harming Russia on the battlefield as much as we could, we imposed sanctions. And finally, we banned them from the financial system. You can't use SWIFT. And oh, by the way, we're going to confiscate about $300 billion of your wealth that's in these foreign banks. Now, if you're Chinese or Japanese or Korean or Thai or in India or anywhere else, and you look at that and you say, good gracious, this is the United States acting like this? These are the people to whom we have entrusted the management and conduct of our financial affairs for decades. So, well, at least since the end of the Second World War. And again, after Nixon took us off the gold standard, we should have learned back then we can't trust these people. This is outrageous. So the Chinese, who are very sensitive to the possibility that we could try and isolate them, began several years ago, very deliberately, in a very, very pragmatic fashion, to build alternatives to our financial system. Yeah, I see that. Trump's plan for a crypto reset to abandon the dollar and wipe away U.S. debt. The way you wipe away U.S. debt at the expense of the rest of the world, well, we don't care about the rest of the world, Paul, as you well know, and I know you know that. We don't care. What we care about is carrying out the will of these super rich billionaire oligarchs in Wall Street and making sure that they get their way. But will you wipe out debt with bankruptcy? This is one of the things that kept LaRouche out of the general press for so long, was he was showing how the United States just goes into bankruptcy, goes back to the system that Roosevelt had, where you couldn't, the banks, the national banking system that had your mortgage, that had your pension, that had your retirement, where it was illegal for them to gamble with your revenue, with your money. And that's what yeah, that's what that was all about. I'll think of it in a moment here. Anyway, that you wipe it out through bankruptcy and you start all over again. And you tell all of these banks that have these hedge funds and all this Vegas casino gambling with your money and your mortgage and everything else they've done. Too bad. The loss is yours. Goodbye. Get out of here. And you start all over again with national currency. Now, the first thing that, the Chinese, as I said, are extremely smart people, as most of the people on this planet are, but they saw what was coming, and they saw in the midst of their productive economic boom, where they've taken 850 million Chinese out of poverty and given them at least a middle-class life now. They've been setting up a system that's gold-backed. They don't need the SWIFT system to settle debts. I heard this the other day. I don't remember who was talking about it. But there's this giant warehouse in China right now, a giant warehouse full of gold. And on one side is the Chinese gold, and on the other side, let's just say Russian gold. Of course, there's many, many countries who have gold in this location. And the moment the Russian economy has somewhat of a debt with the Chinese in trade deficits or whatever else, some of the Russian gold goes across the other side of the floor to the Chinese side. And likewise, vice versa. When the Chinese, for some trade imbalance somewhere with the Russians, are suddenly at the Russian debt, money leaves the Chinese side and goes back to the Russian side. And then they both have adequate armies there to protect their gold interests. Could it be that simple? Now, they have to have a gold-backed currency in the BRICS economy. And the yuan is not interested in being the reserve currency. But they don't plan on going down with the dollar because they can see what's coming. And when the dollar is debased and fails, they want the yuan separate from that. And so the demand for the dollar right now is plunging to new lows. And Besant, the Treasury Secretary, just closed a deal with Argentina that we would buy, millions, tens of millions or something like that of their pesos, but we would pay them in dollars for it. Well, the whole thing is an unconcealed attempt to try and create demand for the dollar. But the demand's going away. And so that's, as Paul, you mentioned there, the stable coin, which, I mean, that'll destroy the dollar faster than anything that we were talking about destroying the dollar. But for some people, some super rich people in this country, super rich, I mean beyond super rich, I mean multi-billion-dollar rich. I mean hundreds of billions of dollars rich. That's their aim. That's what they want anyway. And that may be the case. I don't know, but I think there's various ways to deal with the default of this country. But that's not a good way to do it because it's going to hurt the majority of the population. And I think the people that surround Trump and his friends, these Wall Streeters, these financial capitalists, so they're looking for a way to insulate themselves from as much harm as possible, not insulate the country, but to insulate themselves and their holdings. But at the same time, to shift the pain, the misery, and the misfortune, spread it out over the rest of us, of the population. Now, I think there's some people who are guests at K-Talk or whatever else who know this much better than I do. It's much more their subject, who know more about finance than I do. But my point is on the Chinese, is that the Chinese have now established, or in the process of establishing, as I said, gold vaults. Big, like Fort Knox, one in China, in Hong Kong, the other in Riyadh, in Saudi Arabia. And the idea is that they want to begin doing business with the various people of the world and saying, if you do business with us in yuan instead of US dollars, you can redeem whatever you purchase, whatever you pay us in gold. And these are essentially warehouses where gold will then be, as I said, transferred from one owner to the next on a national level. And it's really a profound development. And they have been hoarding gold, developing it, buying it in great quantities in order to get to this point. And this is essentially the heart of BRICS. Everybody wants to move to a gold-backed system where we were prior to August of '71. But here in this country, we are resisting that. We don't want, one of the main arguments for the United States not to join the BRICS operation is that we don't want a gold-backed system, because a gold-backed system would stop this incredible trading craziness on Wall Street that's destroying the dollar. But we don't seem to be very interested in inventorying gold. And the Germans and the Italians, for instance, who've already asked for the repatriation of their gold, found out they're not going to get it. We're not going to give it to them because they got about 30 to, I think we've got about 30 to 40% of what they own. And it's in the Federal Reserve banks. And they said, they told the Germans and the Italians, that's all you're going to get. and And they said, well, where's the rest of it? I don't know where it is, but I'm kind of worried about it. And, and I think that the Chinese are building credibility while we are losing credibility. So people are going to be more and more willing to put their gold in these holding vaults in the Hong Kong area, in Hong Kong and in Riyadh, knowing that it's safe and they can be used for these critical trade routes across national lines. And we're going to be the losers because people are going to walk away from it. I mean, it's actually already begun. And I think the other difference with China is the question of actual physical investment. Physical investment in their own country as opposed to what we are doing for physical investment in our country. They've built something, I think it's like 30,000 miles now of high-speed rail in just the last few decades. They're working on nuclear power plants, floating nuclear power plants as Russia is. And the Belt and Road Initiative is real. It's not just a monetary trick. It's a trade of goods. And the intent, I think, is to raise the standard of living everywhere. And it's something that if the United States were in our right mind, we would be cooperating with this. I sometimes have the image of the United States being like a giant black hole where when you get to our ports, suddenly the average freight speed train, and I mentioned this a couple of weeks ago, you know what it is? You know what the average freight train speed around the ports is and out of the ports? 17 miles an hour. There are ships. Remember a couple of years ago, or the COVID stuff, there were ships, hundreds of them offshore because of COVID barriers. Now they're offshore, hundreds of them, because they can't get their ships unloaded fast enough because of the slowness of our ports. And so we don't have manufacturing in this country beyond some automobiles and a refrigerator or two. And we don't have the industry. We don't have the energy. We don't have the transportation that's necessary to move this stuff. But were we to become a part of this, I think it would be an incredible change for the future. There's a couple of things, this domestic infrastructure thing that China is invested in, which is very important. They've also put in $1 trillion of investment into the Belt and Road. And there's another reason for it. It's not just to promote prosperity and commerce and sort of resuscitate the connections that used to exist in China when it was a great imperial state. It's also to negate the impact and the influence of the United States Navy, because China knows that it cannot import oil, gas, and other commodities into the country from the sea. It's going to be in a lot of trouble. And so we are moving Minuteman missiles into the Philippines, AMRAC missiles, increased Pacific Fleet presence in the South China Sea, our jets flying awfully close to Chinese jets. And so the Chinese know that if they can't import gas and oil, which they desperately need from seaports, then they're going to be in serious, serious trouble. And so they recognize that this was one of Trump's trump cards, pardon my pun, that we hold. It's not so much of a surface fleet, it's the submarine fleet that we have. Our submarine fleet is unmatched. Our submarines cannot be tracked, unless, of course, Trump pulls one up off the bottom of the ocean and sends it over to Western European coastline saying, well, here it is, as some kind of an intimidating move against Russia. Other than that one, nobody knows where they're at except the Supreme Navy Command. And maybe in some regard, even they don't know sometimes. And so they can sit offshore in deep water, and anything that comes out can be sunk Anything that goes in can be sunk. So they could shut down China very, very quickly from the sea. And China knows that. So naturally, the Chinese have responded by building these Eurasian landmass lines of communication and rail and everything else. That's why Pakistan has become so important to China. That's why Iran is important to China. And from Iran and through the Suez, I mean, I'm not talking about the Suez Canal, but across the Suez area from Arabia into Egypt by rail. And so you have these lines of rail development going on in Africa right now, so that Africa becomes a part of this giant commercial trading system. And that's the good news for most people. I mean, most of the time, and we should welcome this. There was this program put together, the Golden Spike program, after the Utah Golden Spike thing. It was Douglas McGregor had a lot to do with that, and some people from the Naval Academy. And they were trying to make the argument that if you go back to the day of the railroad, I mean, look what the railroads did to America after the Civil War. And it was absolutely vital to our industrial development as a nation. Rail to this day is still the cheapest means of transporting goods and raw material. In my new office that I have been in for 3 years, I'm on the 6th floor of a building that borders the railroad line, both the front runner as well as Union Pacific. Several times a day, the building shakes, literally shakes, like anywhere from a 3 to a 5.0 earthquake, as the heavy freight goes railing by. That's to run on the rails. With these 4 and 5 locomotives pulling over 100 cars behind them, loaded to the brim. And I look out the window and I can see it. I've seen this daily for 3 years now. We should have that all over this country, which is what China is doing. I mean, we could do something very similar with high-speed rail, but we have to do 2 things. First of all, we have to have high-speed rail from East Coast to West Coast to East Coast. I mean, serious high-speed rail, 300, 400, 500 miles an hour rail. Almost the speed of a commercial jet. China has it, 30,000 miles of it. Then we need to build something else. We need to build high-speed commercial sea lift so that you can pick up goods, let's say in a place like Rochefort in France coast, on the western coast of France on the Atlantic, move it within a couple of days in high-speed rail across the Atlantic, maybe 2 or 3 or 4 days depending upon sea states, into Philadelphia, New York, into Baltimore, Charleston. You go all the way down to Corpus Christi. But my point is, you put in these ports and then you have this high-speed rail right there where the port is, and you move this stuff, you roll the things off on a pre-designed platform because it gets right off the ship, right on the rail car. So if you wanted to do business in Pakistan, Pakistan would be less than 2 weeks away from delivery, from the time it left the United States. But nevertheless, that kind of relationship is difficult to maintain when President Trump says the things he says at the UN General Assembly. And then the other point, that between China and Turkey, that they've promised the Turks on more than one occasion that, and everybody in Washington knows it, the National Security Staff knows it, Turkey promised, China promised Turkey a nuclear weapon if they wanted it. Now you have the same thing happening with Saudi Arabia and Pakistan. I would expect a nuclear-armed missile battery sitting somewhere, perhaps in the empty quarter of Saudi Arabia, I don't know, but that would be owned and operated. It'd be owned by the Saudis, but operated and unmanned and manned, not unmanned, by the Pakistanis. In other words, the Chinese have said, we'll back this. Sure, we'll back it. Well, that means that those missiles would probably be Chinese missiles sold to Pakistan, who then puts them in Saudi Arabia or Turkey. So you're going to see here before long new missiles arriving in Egypt, new missiles arriving in Turkey, and we've already got the Chinese on the ground with missile technology in Iran. So this is, right now, it's not getting too much press. It's kind of a quiet backdoor diplomacy, both financial and militarily, between China and the States that coalescing into a front against Israel and us. Now, it's not because China wants war with us. Nobody wants war with the United States, including Russia. We're the ones that seem to be intent on going to war with everyone else. You know, Trump is a bully. He loves to bully. He takes bullying projects, one bad habit over another time. He talks bully. He acts bully. But I think what you have to reckon with now is that Israel is in a very difficult position. The longer it waits to strike against Iran, the less likely it will have any freedom of maneuver in the future. And I think that's why Netanyahu is meeting with Trump today in the White House. And I think that's probably what Netanyahu was referring to here when he said, we'll deal with this Palestinian state, he said, or something like that. After I get back from the U.S., he said. So is he expecting to get permission or cooperation from another Iran strike? Well, the first thought I had when I heard some pundits and podcasters saying that he's coming to get Trump's bidding for the next attack on Iran, he doesn't need our permission. I think he's in charge. I think Netanyahu is in charge. I think he's coming to tell Trump what he's going to do and what Trump is going to do in support of it. I think he's probably going to sit down with all the key figures, not just Trump, but the Vice President, Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, and the team that comes with him from Israel will sit down with others, primarily in the Department of Defense and the CIA, but primarily Defense and CIA, to sort through the details before he launches another offensive against Iran, to ensure that we, in all aspects, social, financial, political, and all the leaders of those divisions of our culture, are on board. And by the way, I think he's got the similar relationship right now with Starmer in Britain. You know, for this latest strike that was launched, what was it, September 7th? I think so, against Doha. You know, the Royal Air Force supplied the tankers for this attack against the peace planners that was going on in Doha in that residential building. And the Royal Air Force supplied the tankers. MI6 was very much involved in all of this. MI6, the CIA, the Mossad, all involved in destabilizing or working to try to destabilize Syria, bringing a new government to power there, at least insofar as the Islamists, the former Al-Qaeda types, are now running things. And remember, did you hear that interview between David Petraeus and Al-Jawlani the other day? And Petraeus was saying, you know, I was trying to kill you, referring back to the war with Iraq, or the war in Iraq, and the war with Syria, or the extensions into Syria, everything else. I was trying to kill you. And here's Al-Jawlani, who a couple of years ago were cutting people's heads off with a dull butter knife. And now he's sitting there as president of Syria. And Petraeus, some people call him Betraeus, patting him on the back and talking about how they're armed, you know, they're brothers in arms. And oh my gosh, it's just sickening. And so you've got this new government coming to power in Syria, Oh my goodness, we're almost done. I haven't hardly got started. And these other Al Qaeda types running things, and they're also connected to the Kurds, and they're operating in parts of Syria, and then they're also connected to the Israelis and the Druze. In other words, if the Israelis wanted to balkanize Syria, and that's part of the talk right now, they've gotten what they need, and they've gotten what they wanted to do it. And they want to balkanize the Caucasus as well. That's why we're so heavily involved in Azerbaijan. And I think that's being largely shut down now by the Russians, but they want to balkanize Iran, carve it up into smaller crowns, just like NATO and the West, the United States, want to balkanize Russia. I think 12 different districts or so, one for each of the 11 time zones or something like that. So they can all fight against themselves, so they can't defend themselves against us coming in, stealing their strategic minerals. Now, this is the city of London banks and the New York City banks and the banking cartels, and their puppets are all interested in getting control of the Middle Eastern oil, gas reserves, the gas fields, and so forth. And that's what's really going on. And what's happening now is China, which is the principal purchaser of all of that oil and gas, has said, I don't think so. China has stepped and provided the Islamic states in the region with the wherewithal to potentially stand up to Israel and to stand up to us by sending missiles through Pakistan to these other countries. And at the same time, I think Russia has its hand in this, because Russia is not going to stand by and allow us to pulverize Iran out of existence. And with the diminishment of the Russian military activity against Ukraine, right now the Russians are taking casualties in single digits, sometimes double, but mostly single, whereas the Ukrainians continue to lose thousands of people. The Russians can devote a lot more of their time and resources to the Middle East now, and that's what they're doing. Russian soldiers are leaving the Ukraine and showing up in Iran. So you have Russia and China, along with most of the states. Turkey before long is going to have a nuclear weapon, and nobody's going to stop them. And the Turkish people are enraged as what is being done to the Palestinians. And I think we're not even aware. I don't think most Americans understand the true dimension of the tragedy in Gaza. And the bottom line is, people in the Middle East know it. And kind of, it's like Sykes-Picot, treaty is over, it's done. And there won't be any future compromise. And what that means is you're either going to get a Palestinian state or an Israeli state, but you're not going to have both. So the people who talk about it, well, we need a two-state solution, those people are dreaming. The time and opportunity for that solution is years gone by. Now, Israelis, just like ourselves, is viewed as a menace around this planet. We're viewed as a menace, so are the Israelis. And it has to be defeated, and there can't be any quarter given, and that's where we're heading. It's sad, it's tragic, but I think it's inevitable. I mean, earlier this week, I don't remember who it was, Max Blumenthal, Jeffrey Sachs, John, what's his name, said something like the true death toll in Gaza is somewhere around 600,000. That's outrageous. And here we are, bankrolling and enabling it. What a catastrophe. What a ugly smear on the face of the United States. And if the world doesn't know, which they absolutely do, even though most Americans don't, you know, if it all ends up becoming, if that whole area ends up becoming Israel, you know, it's just not human nature to tolerate this kind of oppression. And I don't think it's going to end up that way. It'll end up as a non-apartheid state of some sort. But ultimately, after all of the suffering, I think that's why it's very much incumbent upon us to make the United States a much better place than just make America great again. We're coming up here towards the end of the first hour of the hour. Yeah, we got maybe a minute. I was going to go into a little bit of Russian American history, but I don't think there's any time for that. You know, Bismarck, Otto von Bismarck, was a great admirer of Lincoln. Bismarck called him the man of the century. And people don't realize that Alexander II, the Tsar of Russia, was equally enamored by Lincoln. And they believed that what Lincoln had done in the United States was something that everyone should support, in the sense of building internal infrastructure. Which is kind of interesting because the British and the French were trying to find a way to support the Confederacy. And the two nations we turned into enemies in the 20th century were the two nations that were trying the hardest to help us, especially with the Civil War. The Tsar actually parked his navy in U.S. ports during the winter in order to keep the French and the British out. And Bismarck, who was very, very concerned with the tremendous drain of talent from Prussia, actually kept an open emigration to the United States for Germans because he wanted to help Lincoln win the war. At one point, the entire Second Corps of the United States Army, believe it or not, was German. Well, when the war ended, of course, that's when Bismarck intervened and he said, that's it, we're not sending any more Germans because we're losing all our talent. We're losing all my best people. All right. Looks like it's 9 o'clock. I don't see anything popping up on K-Talk yet, so I'm going to end my broadcast at K-Talk. I will save this, and then there it is. I will see you all tomorrow. And for those of you who were part with me on the stream, I appreciate your being a part of it. Please like and subscribe. I'd like to see these numbers build. You know, most of the people who hear this hear it on a recorded fashion later, not live. But I appreciate your being a part of the program today. And you can make comments, or you can make comments that the K-Talk people can't. Just click on the comment button. All right.